Welcome back to History 101. My name is Christina Paris. I'm your instructor for this course, and tonight we're going to be covering Chapter 21, The Modern Nation, 1919 to 1928. So we're going to open up, as usual, with an American portrait, and this time we're going to be talking about America's sweetheart. So, for those of you who are not familiar with that nickname, the America's Sweetheart that we're talking about is actress Mary Pickford. Now, some of you may have heard Mary Pickford, so it might not be completely surprising for you to hear of Mary Pickford. But Mary Pickford was actually a silent film star, a very prominent silent film star, in fact. She was one of the wealthiest women in America in the 1920s, very prominent figure in Hollywood, and she would become very well known for her time. Very influential woman. In fact, she was one of the founding artists of United Artists, production company that has become very well known in Hollywood. She also became the epitome of the new women of the 1920s, a woman, self-made woman, the embodiment of what women could achieve. Although her characters were kind of these coquettish, very dependent, very needy, very vulnerable characters that she portrayed on screen, she actually embodied women that were very driven, were very career minded, very much the emerging new characteristic of a woman of this new era, so to say, of the 1920s. I like to characterize the 1920s in American culture as being the teenage years of the United States. The 1920s really becomes this time period for the United States as this kind of testing the limits of American society. We have the Victorian era that's really this kind of repressed childhood. You under the constraints of your parents. You have to follow these guidelines. And the 1920s is everything goes. Forget the rules, forget the restraint, the constraint. You're sneaking out, you're doing all these wild things. Essentially, everything goes in the 1920s. The gone are the tight corsets. You see women dropping the corsets in favor of the bralette, which is the precursor to the modern bra. You see the loosening of sexual morals. You have this very tight Victorian repressive thing with sexual ideologies. And in the 1920s, everything goes for sex. You have the introduction of the automobile, which introduces a whole new culture, a whole new vision of what you can do and testing the limits and the stretches of how you can travel, leisure culture, and again, what you can do in an automobile, which I'm sure some of you are probably cringing and going, oh my word, what you can do in an automobile? Yeah, I'm sure some of you are probably wiggling around in your seat right now going, you mean, yeah. If you thought that your generation was the first teen generation to do things in an automobile, think again. Your great grandparents were the first generation to do things in automobiles that you thought you were probably the first generation to do. So yeah, you got to rethink that too, folks. They figured it out pretty fast, because up until then we'll be talking about how in Victorian era, when you went courting, um, when your couples went courting, it was a very strict thing of you generally went out on a horse and buggy and you were accompanied by an adult. In the 1920s, once the automobiles introduced, young men and young women could go out alone without an accompanying adult, and all sorts of fun started happening. And yeah, so yeah, there's a loosening of morals happening, and it introduces the whole new way of life in the 1920s. And we'll talk about how movie culture also introduces things and introduces the ideology, the sex idol. And one of my personal favorites, oh gosh, Rudolph Valentino, makes women swoon for the first time by introducing what a man should be, and changes for the first time what the ideal man is for a woman, and really kind of challenges that preconception of what a man should be for a woman, through visual culture. So anyway, I'm getting ahead of myself, so we'll move on here. With the dynamic economy, the development of industry. So we see a switch from coal to electricity with our factories. Obviously, electricity has changed the economy tremendously by this point in time. We're seeing a switch over now entirely, even in our factories, now modernizing completely and adopting electricity, which is a tremendous change. Mm-hmm. It's a tremendous modernization effort. So we're seeing this dramatically transform even our economy. Mass production is coming into its modernization as well. And we see this first being adopted by our good friend Henry Ford. And you're probably going, wait a second, Henry Ford, that name sounds familiar. How does it sound familiar? Ah, yes, our good friend Henry Ford with his famed automobile. Yes. Mass production, obviously, with the automobile. And he radicalizes this with the production of the automobile, with the assembly line, which dramatically, when he first introduces it, he's able to produce automobiles to some degree, but they're still kind of on the pricey side. He's not able to produce quite the mass production that he needs to really put an automobile in everybody's driveway. When he refines it even further and gets more people and streamlines the process even more so, that is, he puts more people and breaks down the process even further, so he's tripling the production in an average day and pumping out more automobiles each day. The price of a car drops down to where it's affordable for every person, every American, to get a car. Suddenly, everybody's able to afford an automobile. And this radically changes the landscape of the United States, because now you have a car that was, say, $350, which was a substantial amount of money at that point in time, that suddenly drops down to about $150. And still a little bit on the pricey side, but it's a little bit more affordable, especially when the idea of credit it comes into being. Now you're probably going, credit? Yes, credit becomes a new idea at this point in time. Um, Obviously, this is going to have detrimental consequences, because credit is going to start to get people into trouble, and this is going to move us into building up the idea that's going to get people into trouble once the Great Depression rolls around. Because these ideas of credit are much riskier than the common conception of credit we have nowadays. These risks of credit are much more open-ended and have greater risks than the credit that we have today. So anyway, naturally, these ideas of mass production increased productivity, which drove the economy and built the economy up. The economy is rising exponentially, which ultimately is building the economy to a pinnacle that's not going to be seen again until after the Second World War. So it's building to a massive height. Of course, one thing that we're going to talk about is only large companies can afford mass production. This idea of mass production is very costly because obviously you're breaking down production to such a point that it is very expensive. I mean, you're tearing down a process of constructing an object to the most minute detail. You're tearing down a process of building an automobile where every single bolt is bolted down by literally a different person. Or every single component is put together by a different person. Can a small business afford to employ that many people? Well, obviously the answer is no. You can't. This is a process that can only be afforded by large companies. Small businesses can't compete to sustain that kind of production. Mergers gave them more control, obviously. So again, it's in favor of large companies. However, the image of big business is substantially improving through this time. You know, we've had this idea of big businesses kind of being this evil entity. We had the trust busting that was going on because of this image of the robber barons. But suddenly, big businesses are no longer greeted with suspicion and the idea of the robber baron any longer. Suddenly, they're starting to be looked at more kindly, more congenially. There's this idea that maybe they're not all bad guys. Maybe they're actually good guys. Maybe they've actually got some ideas that might better society and improve society. Unfortunately, this is probably going to lead to the downfall of American society, as we're going to see. Because with this trust, people are going to let their guards down, and they're going to start investing their money very heavily in companies. And as we are going to see, this is going to have detrimental consequences for the American economy and for the average American. So the transformation of work and the workforce. Scientific management is going to take off during this period. We're going to start to see a huge investment in the concept of scientific management. This idea that companies can be managed with this thought process that a company can be managed in a more efficient, um, thought out manner, more micromanaged, so to say. Increased supervision, mass production resulted in less satisfying work. So there's a turn away from looking at workers as human beings and turning more to this idea that you need to improve efficiency. Obviously, this is going to lend to more of a need for leisure activities for the workers after hours, which is kind of interesting because feeding into this 1920s culture, um, you're going to have the passage of the Volstead Act, the prohibition, which is ultimately going to lead to the dry nation. So alcohol is going to vanish, or at least we think alcohol is going to vanish. Alcohol isn't going to vanish, folks. What's going to happen is alcohol is going to go underground. Essentially, people are going to find other ways to get their booze. And the way they go about getting alcohol is sometimes scary and sometimes entertaining. There is a rise in, if you remember me talking about patent medicines, the market is suddenly amazingly flooded with cure-alls. And interestingly enough, even though we have this regulation on patent medicines, there is a sudden surge in patent medicines that actually managed to somehow make it onto the market. And these medications, intriguingly enough, have very high alcohol contents. So people are chugging down their patent medicines for everything from nervous conditions to persistent coughs to rheumatism to gout, whatever it is that ails them, even things that don't ail them, just to get their alcohol. Needless to say, they're finding ways to get alcohol. There's a huge conversion movement. Yes, conversion movement, folks, to Catholicism. Yeah, they're even going to the point of converting. You guessed it, communion wine. Religious purposes. You can drink if you're receiving communion. Yeah, it's tragically amusing that people are actually suddenly finding their faith just to get a little sip of wine. It's devastatingly entertaining how people are going about it, and it's also frightening. Because some people are even going about it that they're drinking perfume to get alcohol. Granted, it's not the right kind of alcohol, but they are so transfixed on getting anything with alcohol, they're drinking even perfume to get alcohol. And we do know that there are cases of people that went blind and even died from attempting to make their own alcohol. You've heard of bathtub gin? Yeah. They made their own, or attempted to make their own alcohol. And there's a lesson to be learned in that, folks. Don't do it. Because there were a number of people that went blind and even died from attempting to make their own gin at home. So yes, it was some rather daunting times. So with that, We do see a growth of white collar jobs. There's a lot of management positions that do start to open up. Um, we see a move to economy based on sales and service. We also see a lot of women entering the workforce. As I mentioned, women are starting to shift their eyes away from home and starting to shift into entering the workforce. Um, they're not going to be necessarily entering into what we consider non-traditional jobs just yet. We're going to see an interesting shift happen with World War II, where women are going to start to enter into non-traditional positions. Right now, women are going to be entering into clerical positions, entering into operator position, telephone operator positions. They're going to be entering into positions like this that are considered, I hate to say stereotypical women positions. Also, we're going to be seeing women that are going to enter into considered household positions, maid, cooks, those kind of positions, laundress positions. We do also see the defeat of organized labor. They did not expand into white collar jobs. There was prosperity going on, so in those positions, so there was not seen as a need for unionization. Corporate promotion of welfare capitalism also kept labor at bay. Court decisions aided the growth of the open shop as well. The AFL refused to expand to include women, socialists, African American workers. So this also kept the unions, unfortunately, at bay. So we have those key court decisions as well that do hold labor back and prevent labor from really getting a toehold during this particular era as well. Then we have the decline of agriculture. There's the mechanization of agriculture. You have to remember, again, that this is a period after the First World War. We've seen the mechanization of warfare. We're going to see it continue on with agriculture as well. We see the expansive irrigation systems developing that allow for irrigation of fields and that in areas that we haven't seen before. This does aid in farms being irrigated now. It did depend on the size and also the migrant labor that was available as well. Mid-sized farms could not compete. This also leads to commercial farms expanding and dominating the landscape, especially in the Midwest. We're going to see commercial farms becoming more and more prevalent and forcing out the smaller, independently owned farms. Low prices became a result of the competition and the changing American diets. We're going to see a steady drop off in the need for grains. During World War I, there right after the war, there was an expansive need for grain surplus grain in filling up the void for Europe. So the Midwest becomes this kind of breadbasket for Europe because the Europeans did not have the grain crops. Their fields had been decimated by the war. So we were exporting huge quantities of grain. We were filling that void. But in subsequent years, right after the war, that as the European crops recovered, that that need began to dwindle. So our crops were no longer needed. So all of a sudden there's a surplus. So the we wound up with a surplus. So all of a sudden this it dropped off. So more Americans began to live in the cities than the country by 1920. So there's this decline in farming and this growth in the industrial economy that we start to see. Again, the rise of the automobile begins to play a prominent role, as we talked about. And we see a growth in the suburbs start. And what exactly is the suburb? I'm sure you've probably heard this term. We actually, surprisingly enough, maybe some of you know this, maybe some of you don't know this. We are actually considered a suburb of Los Angeles. And you're probably going, wait a second, we're a suburb of Los Angeles. Yeah, we're actually considered a suburb of an urban area, which would be Los Angeles. And you're probably thinking, wait a second, that's a long way away, isn't it? But we're considered a suburb of an urban area. And at one point, we would have probably also been considered a suburb of San Bernardino or Riverside. But those areas are not quite as developed as Los Angeles. So you can kind of consider us of those three major cities. So we're actually a suburb. It's an area that's connected to a larger urban district. So it gives you an idea of what a suburb is. So then we see a spread of consumerism. Happiness and leisure and consumption rather than work. It led to increased efficiency, higher wages, and increased leisure hours. Was one of the critical marks. We see the growth of advertising as well. It's interesting to look in advertisements of this era, how advertising really begins to blossom in the 1920s. I love, my favorite ad of this era is the ad of for Listerine mouthwash. That you don't want your life destroyed by the dread disease halitosis. Well, for any of you that know what halitosis really is, it's the clinical name for bad breath. But for back then, when you didn't know what halitosis was, it sounds like a dread disease. But halitosis is actually the clinical name for bad breath. Bruce Barton was the man nobody knows. He actually became legendary for his knowledge of advertising. We see the rise of consumer credit, mortgage loans, consumer credit and mortgage loans became the way that people can enter into this burgeoning life of consumerism that is flourishing in this point in time. If you can't afford that brand new washing machine, now a washing machine in this point in time, you're probably thinking, a washing machine? They have washing machines like we have? No. A washing machine was essentially a round tub that essentially shook back and forth. Then you'd pull the clothes out of the washing machine and run it through an old-fashioned wringer that was attached to the top of the tub, and that was a washing machine. It had the agitation feature, and that was what consisted of an automatic washing machine in the 1920s. They still charged a lot for it. It's about $15 to $20. So consumer credit would allow you to buy that on time. In other words, spread out over a period of time. So, consumer credit and mortgage loans, so you could buy a house mortgaged out over a period of time. So, say your home was $500 or $1,000. You could spread that out over a period of time. So that gives you an idea of how these loans worked and this credit worked. These were ideas that were starting to blossom in this period of time. It gave you a chance to buy these things over a period of time so that you were not spending all your money at once or money that you did not have. You were able to afford this, buy into this new life, so you could keep up with the Joneses, even though this idea hadn't even emerged yet. You could feel this decadence of this era, and be part of this new era. So anyway, this was how the 1920s was. So with this, I think we'll start up here for this first part of the lecture, and we'll open up the next part by talking about the new pleasures for a mass audience.